So, Joel and Gabriel, I would invite the two of you to just reflect on what you heard Russell say, the observations that that he's made, and just share some of your thoughts.
Well, as usual, Russell is very compelling and accurate in calling out some of the problem, but at the center of it, there is an assurance and a confidence in the sovereignty of God. I loved the little riff about God calling out leaders from those who seem to be the most problematic. God calling out redemption in the midst of times that were most tumultuous and discouraging. And so my sense is, my heart is, that it's very tempting during these times to play the victim and to feel helpless. But that's a profound misunderstanding of my strength is made perfect in your weakness. And now that we understand how helpless you are, to turn the tide of this culture that increases in animosity and hostility, perhaps you can learn to take on my nature, where it's the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. And so there was just I look back at Gabriel after Russell got done, and Gabriel said, "He's so good," and he is. So thank you.
Yeah, amen. He is so good. Look, I've heard Russell a few times, but this today he struck me as a true prophet vis-a-vis what I think ails much of American Christianity, which is a critic. Right? Prophets are not critics, although they critique. And I kind of hear it's not Pollyanna. He's squarely looking at the challenges, as the gospel calls us to do. We squarely look at the challenges of the feelings of polarization and divisiveness and homelessness of Christians. But it's the prophet Zephaniah, when he tells the exiles, God is singing songs of hope over you. And so the prophet, the prophetic branch of the church, doesn't just critique. It always anchors a very necessary critique of the situation with hope. And, I think that is a gift that we need to be reminded of, especially when we feel, rightly or wrongly, that we're under siege. And so I'm refreshed that we're seeing kind of that biblical example of what it means to be a prophet. Right? Tanahashi quotes, who's a great critic. He's a critic. He's not a prophet, because the prophet or the prophetic strand of the church looks squarely at the challenges, but always anchors us in the hope of the resurrection. Russell often signs his books Acts 13:30. But God raised him from the dead. That's what Acts 13:30 says. And so I feel that sounding through.
Each of you, all of you, have occasion. You've been invited to speak into the lives of people in significant positions of political influence. Presidents, let's say, of the United States. How do you know when you're being used?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I have a fairly simple answer because I'm a fairly simple person. If someone is asking you to do something that will increase their power, you're being used. That's not always bad. I mean, they got in the position from asking for help from people. So I'm not trying to make that action in the pejorative sense an evil action. But there are other folks that we have been with that just kind of wanted to get to know what we do, wanted to help with what we do, kind of what is your lane, come alongside, and so on and so forth. Let me tell you a story. Old guys tell a lot of stories. And Russell, you may remember this. It was in the Oval Office. We were together. There was a meeting on immigration. And President Obama and Vice President Biden were sitting with there were maybe a half a dozen of us, denominational leaders, and they were trying to figure out, okay, how could we work together to improve the immigration situation? Not trying to drive us toward a certain policy, but just really exploring. And so I was the only local pastor in the group. So I said, what can a little old local pastor do? And of course I was very close to President Obama, and he just kind of smiled. But Joe Biden, in true Joe Biden style. Now you got to realize, Joe Biden has been in politics like this. It's who he is. It's what he does. And he looked at me and said, "Pastor," he said, "if you could just get every one of your congregation members to write their local congressman, that'd mean a lot. That'd make a big difference." And I looked at him and I said, Mr. Vice President, I can't even get every one of my congregation members to obey the 10 Commandments, let alone write the congressman. And to me, it was a encapsulated moment of a political mentality. How can I use your constituency? Do you have a deliverable constituency that will be of use to me? Again, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that's the political way. That's the way of being used. But in our tradition, that's not what you use a congregation for. That's not the way you approach a congregation. Our lane is moral and spiritual development, and certainly there are ways to address immigration that are spiritually formative and spiritually maturing, but they're not just the old, well, write your congressman. So in answer to your question, it's fairly easy, and all of us have been here, to understand that good people will instrumentalize, I think is a really good term that was used today, your relationship to achieve their ends. And that's fairly easy to see. Again, it's totally understandable. But there are other people. In my years with President Obama, he never did that one time. He never asked me to do anything for him. Our times together were about his family, about his faith, about, how do you go through this together? And he never, ever asked a favor. So I would come home and people would say, don't you know he's just using you? And my reply would be, how do you know I'm not just using him? That's people's assumption. But you can tell fairly quickly when you're with someone if they're just trying to gain what you have for their own ends.
That's good. Thanks, Joel. Russell?
We had a similar conversation right after, I think it was that same meeting, because then Vice President Biden said, "So there are what, 30 to 40 million evangelical Christians in the country? If you can get every one of them to call their congressman today, we can get immigration fixed." And President Obama said, "Joe, if he could get 30 to 40 million evangelicals to pick up a phone today, we wouldn't be here." Joe was a really good response. I think when it comes to that question of should you relate to a political leader or a civic leader, the fundamental question has to be, what am I doing there? So I would make a big difference between, for instance, I'm meeting with the mayor of my city in order to talk about what we're going to do in our city for, say, the homeless population there. That's somebody who's in office. You're relating to that person as a citizen, and nobody would be able to construe that as some sort of a political endorsement or use of your, especially if you're somebody who's in ministry, use of the authority that has been given to you as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ that does not translate and cannot translate over to partisan political advocacy. When you're having those kinds of conversations, I think that's not only okay ethically, it's somewhat obligated upon you when you're in those kinds of places. Where you have to be careful is when you're going to be instead a political prop. So if what a leader wants from you is, I want to hear from you, I want to know whether or not we can work together on something, that's when I would do it. If instead what I'm being asked to do is to give a political candidate my church directory for, if I'm pastoring a church in Iowa or something and they want it to get people out to vote, or I've seen this happen many times where somebody comes in to give his or her testimony right before election day. Those kinds of manipulative kinds of tactics that seem to put the partisan identity of some political figure with the mission of the church. What that means, though, is if you actually are willing to engage with people, you're not just engaging with the people you would want to be elected. You're instead talking to the people who are in office regardless of whether you like them or not. And if you do that consistently over time, and there are always going to be people who will say, you shouldn't be meeting with anybody that I don't approve of. I mean, that's, Jesus says they played the dirge and said you wouldn't cry, and then we played a happy song, you wouldn't dance. John came in fasting and not drinking, and they said he had a demon. Jesus came in eating and drinking, and they said, look at him, he's a glutton and a drunkard and eats with tax collectors and sinners. There's a certain amount of that you cannot help. But beyond that, if you're not conveying a sense of, I'm using this authority in order to support this political project or agenda, but instead I'm here trying to speak counsel and wisdom into it, I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, I think both Joel and Russell speak to that. I remember that immigration meeting, and I remember emails after that immigration meeting. And one of the questions is, what are you doing there? You're being used. So that's spot on. I think when I used to pastor in New York, I was part of a coalition of evangelical pastors, and they always used to say, be careful. I remember I was maybe 30-something years old when I first heard it, that you don't become rent-a-collar. Rent-a-collar. I never heard that. And rent-a-collar is when they call all the clergy that speak on an issue, although they haven't spoken to them all year or haven't spoken to them about other issues. I think, Augustine or Augustine, depending on your tradition, talks about the summa bonum. What's the highest good? And if you're seeking the highest good from a gospel-centered perspective, and you're at every corner trying to eschew or avoid a tacit endorsement, or what can be seen as a tacit endorsement, I think you're in a safe space. I always tell my sons this. I have two sons. I say, you can't control people's interpretation. You can only control your intention and your action. And so anytime before you go to a meeting, I think before you ask about what people might say, you need to ask yourself the deep leadership and discipleship question. Why am I going? Do I want a photo op? Do I want to seem like I have influence and power? Or am I going because I can be an advocate for something that blesses the city I live in or the town I live in? And so before we ask about the perception issue, I think that it's good Christian formation to ask about the intention issue. Why am I here? Why am I going? Why am I saying yes? Is there personal gain in this? Or is there really a gospel gain in this? Is there a gospel intention behind that? And I think that at least helps you to guard above all other things your heart. And then the second thing is, this morning in one of the speeches, they said, we have to do a lot of preventive work. We need to speak to our congregations ahead of time, and we have to disciple them about what it means to be a pastoral, a prophetic, an ecclesial voice in the civic space. And I think that helps us mitigate ahead of time, to the degree it's possible, how people perceive your involvement. Last thing I would say is consistency. If you meet with one side of the aisle, you've got to meet with the other side of the aisle. The issue is that we live in often a zero-sum game, that once you meet with one side, the other side won't invite you. Mm-hmm. You can't control that. But as long as you're willing to do it, I think you're on good ground.
I want to ask a personal question, and I want to do it in a way that is honoring to your wives. Because it's one thing to be a person in a ministry position who has been called to stand in the place of moral courage, where you are maligned and ridiculed, and you could add a lot of other words, I'm sure, based on your experience. Speak a word to pastors who maybe it hasn't gotten that bad yet, but it might be coming, and what it is like to support your wife who's, she signed up with you forever, but it's hard and awful. And so could you just reflect on that?
Gosh, thanks for bringing this up, Carmen. You talk about the unsung heroes of the ministry. Becky and I have been married for 51 years now, and we are wired so completely differently. As God's got this great sense of humor. She is so careful and always stays in the lines, and she's more defensive about me than, I've got an unreasonable, irrational degree of confidence. My first reaction if somebody doesn't like me is that, well, obviously they ought to be Baker acted because they're a danger to themselves or other people. There's no basis for it. I'm a man of below average ability. I don't even know where it came from. But I don't pay the cost of worrying about what people think. My wife bears that entire burden. Not because she's afraid for herself, but she's afraid for me. And she's been afraid for our kids. And leadership requires not just risk, but injury. I mean, that's what leadership is. And so this long-suffering, I'll try to keep you out of as much manure as I possibly can, knowing that you probably won't listen to me if you're convinced this is what you need to do, and we'll figure it out. And so what I do all the way along is that there isn't a day that goes by that I don't say to her how much I love her, how much I appreciate her, how my life would be an absolute wreck, without her, because I have no, I'm tied to Real by a kite string, and she's the string. And so I just tell her, if I've ever done anything good in this life, it's because she was with me. But she still, has to live. I mean, this is 55 years of ministry of just go for it, because my motto has always been change the world, and if you die, you die. Her motto has always been safety first. So you can imagine how that goes. But, we are still 50 some years later, each other's best friend. We laugh together. And I cannot tell you how much I admire that woman. So thank you for that question.
I think the secret to our marriage has been a conversation we had really early on, where one of us said, you know what? Let's just agree to never panic at the same time. And that has actually played itself out, where there will be moments where one of us is stressing out about something and the other, a switch almost, I need to be the stable one right now.
Yeah.
And we just sort of instinctively go into those modes. And that has been life-giving in our situation. It also is the case that we know each other's points of vulnerability, and my wife Maria especially knows where I need certain things. So, for instance, she knows that my particular point of vulnerability isn't bitterness towards them. It's nostalgia. I sort of go back and re-edit things out. And so she almost has to come in and say, you're kind of living in fantasy world here. It really was that bad. Those kinds of things. She knows how to do that. In our situation, have always been less worried about her in that respect than I was about my children. And that's because of my own father, who was a pastor's son and who had a very conflicted relationship with the church, because he grew up in a parsonage right next to the church, and everything would kind of go through the kitchen, and everything that was being said about his dad would come through there, and it really left a mark. And so I have really tried to be as careful as possible to keep my sons out of that kind of thing. My oldest son, who's in the Air Force now, joined a Calvary Chapel church near his Air Force base in Idaho, and he called me. It was last year. He called. He said, "Hey, I've got to give my testimony tonight." And so what they want us to do is not only to talk about how we came to know Christ, but to give all of our spiritual background. So I'm working that out to do that. He said, "But I wanted to ask you, it seems like we were always in Baptist churches, and then we were part of a non-denominational church. Was there like a story behind that?" And I told my wife,
you just reach around and you're like, I
don't know whether to do a drug test or to say thank you God. We actually did manage to protect him from that. But I think you kind of have to know the dynamics of your house to know specifically, okay, what are the best ways to kind of read if what's happening is that people are empathetically kind of bearing all of that, or if you have people who are scared, or people maybe who are getting combative and they find themselves just looking at all that stuff. You just have to sort of know which of those things is there.
Thanks.
Wow. So I've been married 22 years to Jeanette, and she's courageous. So we co-lead. I belong to a tradition that ordains women. I'm an Assemblies of God pastor. And so we co-lead pastor. And I met Jeanette, I'm 50 years old. I met her when she was 16, and I was 16. We're both 50 years old, so she's my high school sweetheart. And then she left to be a missionary in Ghana and Accra. And so she's a leader in her own right. So I'm blessed that I have a, she's a Deborah, she's an Esther. That's her personality, that's her temperament. But like Joel, if they attack her, she's good. She's like, but if they attack me, or my boys, I have two sons, one's 18 and one's 15. That's a different thing.
Yeah.
That's mom. That's wife, And some years ago, probably like 10, 11, I don't remember, I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I got a lot of hate mail, a lot. And I actually got a threat at my job and at my son's daycare at the time. That was the worst ministerial. That almost took me, Russell, to the place of, I will no longer speak in this. I had a Jeremiah moment after, Pasher and put him in the stocks. I'm like, I have an education. I can do something else. I can go to do something else. But my wife, Jeanette, had so discipled my sons to tell them, oh, no. Fear should never have the last words. And because she had discipled them, they re-discipled me.
Yeah.
And they said, that's not who we are. And that's not what God has called us to do. So I have been blessed by that, but I can't imagine, the burdens that she has borne in secret. So I don't know if y'all have done this, but I don't want to tell her to burden her. But sometimes I tell guys, and how much has she not told you to not burden you? And so she's incredibly courageous and grace-filled, but she's also very thoughtful. So she's like, do you need to talk about this or do you need to be silent? We give each other room for that. I think the most important thing is that from early on, we said, this is a team. The Salgueros are a team. And if Christ is at the center, we're going to get to where God wants us to be. But the truth is, the moments of death threats and mischaracterizations, which I just recently lived through, they've been hard. Mm-hmm. I don't want to romanticize this thing. We almost got divorced. It's hard. Mm-hmm. And when we tell people, my wife is phenomenal. I haven't been all that great in balancing, because there's an adrenaline to being invited to the White House and if you're not careful and you're not self-reflective and say, hey, buddy, you need to stay home. You need to be with John Gabriel and Seth. And you need to, what is it that Henry Nouwen once did when the president called him? And he was attending a person with some mental illness. He told the president of the United States, I'm with John, so you'll have to wait. Right. And so Jeanette grounds me in the reality that my first calling is husband and father. And I think I ground her because she has her own platform in her own right in that way. And so I think that dance, we dance, huh?
Yeah, it's good.
It's a dance, salsa or waltz or whatever you guys do over there. But
he looks at me and says,
Baptist, so there will be no dancing.
There's no dancing.
or minuet.
You stand firmly. Yeah, so it's a dance, and you balance that.
That's good. So you've all three, I mean, you've already testified to this in front of us, so I feel comfortable asking. You've engaged the immigration question, maybe not in recent days, but you've engaged this question. I mean, do the three of you have a resolution? Because if so, let's hear it. I mean, if God's going to do a new thing, right? If there's a new thing on the horizon, somebody's going to have to see it and speak it into being. And so if there's a vision and you guys want to share it, we're open to hearing it.
Well, I think it's a different moment. I mean, there was a time in American history where one could say, okay, here are these legitimate concerns about security and about border protection. We can do those. And here are concerns about the neighbors that we have who are fearful of being deported but are good citizens. We can address that too. And we can find a way to do both of those things. I just don't think we're in that moment right now. And so rather than to say, well, here are a set of proposals that are going to be able to fix the immigration system, instead, I think we have to look underneath that and say, we may differ on what to do about immigration. What we can't differ on, if we're the people of Christ, is immigrants themselves.
Amen.
And so often what has to happen, and what I've found is if you have people, especially churches, if churches are actually engaged with people in their communities who are in seeking asylum, refugees, new immigrant communities, so forth, those are the churches who are going to have a connection with those people in a way that transforms and changes things. But I think at this moment, it's less about, okay, here's this broken system, let's just fix it. That's not happening anytime soon. Mm-hmm. Instead, we're looking at a rise of a global ethno-nationalist, anti-migrant sort of fervor that easily translates over into some really dark and awful stuff. We have to make sure that does not happen, and to help disciple people on the other end of that when they're hearing a lot of reasons to have it. So I wish I had I think we're right on the precipice of a grand compromise on immigration, but I don't.
Look, I think, and actually it is true, that these two gentlemen and many, many, many others have been talking about this for decades, right? I think the last major reform was in 1986 under President Ronald Reagan. And so the Bible doesn't give policy recommendations. I wish it did. It could be much easier. Hey, in this book of the Bible, this chapter and this verse, it tells you exactly what to do. But the Bible is not a policy book. You know, it gives you the Christian virtues and principles and narratives from which you form your discipleship and your worldview. That being said, I think that, you know, the evangelical immigration table, of which all of us have partaken in one way or another in years past and in recent history, it tells us that, hey, what are the biblical principles that inform us? What do we do with Romans 13 about being subject to authority without ignoring Romans 12, be not conformed to this world, right? Because people jump to Romans 13 like if Romans 12 didn't exist. So you have to have a kind of holistic view of the gospel and what the 96 verses in the Hebrew Bible or in the Old Testament that speaks about the immigrant. And actually, it talks to nations, not individuals, on how to treat